for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, to the merits of giving and the other perfections. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, to the merits of giving and the other perfections. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, to the merits of giving and the other perfections. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. And for those, if you're following along in the text, we're on page 99. And our topic for today is actually, first of all, I was just looking through this whole text. It's just a wonderful, I was reminding myself as I was looking through it, what a wonderful text Lama Tsongkhapa offers you. But so all through this text, it's very practical and important. But then this particular section about how to purify negative karma from a practice point of view is particularly, in some ways, important. And so that's this topic now, is how to purify our negative karma using the 4 powers. And so Lama Tsongkhapa starts this section by saying, if despite your effort not to be tainted by such faulty conduct, some fault occurs under the influence of non-conscientiousness or the multitude of mental afflictions, it's inappropriate to let the matter rest without giving it any consideration. So that's interesting, right? So I just want to point out, the reason why I read that is, he mentions 2 different reasons why, he's saying, if you've contemplated karma, the teachings, and then you want to do well, right? You want to create good karma and avoid bad karma. He's pointing out, there are many reasons why people make mistakes, but he's mentioning 2 of them. One is non-conscientiousness, right? So sort of not being aware, not being mindful, not remembering. A lack of mindfulness is another way of saying that. Or the other is due to the multitude of our mental afflictions, right? And can you relate to that? In other words, if you think back to when you make mistakes, when you do negative actions, right? Sometimes you're not mindful, you're not thinking, right? Other times it's just, what's the say it, like you can get overwhelmed by your own mental afflictions. And it's like you mean well, you may say, okay, I want to be a, whatever, ethical person, I want to treat others well, and then there sometimes comes a moment where because we're habituated to them, we're immature and spiritually, we sometimes get overwhelmed by our mental afflictions, and then we do something. And so what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying here is, of course, if we're beginners, of course that's going to happen, right? And there's a famous story they tell about like Atisha, right? I've mentioned this before. That Atisha used to carry, Atisha, the great Indian master who came to Tibet and taught Lamrim for the first time, wrote the first text, right, in Tibet, that this is in that genre. Right? He used to carry a stupa around with him. And whenever he would make mistakes, he would like do the 4 powers, this practice, and he would walk around the stupa as he was doing it. And so there was that, people said like when he was traveling on horseback, it was like it could take a long time to get somewhere if you were traveling with a teacher, because anytime he would make a mistake, he would get off his horse and start doing practice. But he was trying to illustrate how a real practitioner practices, right? He was doing what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying here, right? He doesn't let it rest. Even for a few minutes, he wouldn't let it rest. And traditionally they say at least don't let it rest overnight, whereas before you go to bed, do this practice of confession. Right, and this is in line with what we've said. Lama Tsongkhapa has said things like this before, right? He's saying, we all have faults, but we need to face them, right, and admit them to ourselves and confess them to ourselves and to the Buddha, and redress them. He says it is therefore necessary to make an effort at the means for addressing them, for addressing the issue, as is taught by the compassionate teacher, meaning the Buddha. And then he clarifies the point. He says the next sentence. He says there are 2 different kinds of problems. One he calls a downfall. Just to be clear, what he's referring to there is if you've taken vows and you break a vow. And he mentions 3 types of vows. And it was interesting, the commentary said that phrase, 3 types of vows, in this case, and usually it seems to refer to what they call the vows of individual liberation. So that's either you could, some people take like the layperson vows, like not to kill, not to steal, and so on. Or it could be monk or nun vows. That's one type of vow. Then there's the bodhisattva vows that one can take. So vows based in bodhicitta and compassion. And then there are tantric vows. If you take yoga or highest yoga tantra initiations, there are certain vows and commitments associated with those. And so what he's saying here is, if the negativity you've done is breaking a vow you've taken, and of course if you haven't taken vows, this doesn't apply to you, but if you take any of those vows and then you break it, right? What he's saying is, in that case, each set of vows has its own way of fixing or addressing the problem. There are different ceremonies or different rituals or different sort of practices to do if you break any of those three sets of vows. And he's saying, so if you've chosen to take some kind of vow like that, and then you break that. So if you chose, for example, of the lay person vows, there's a vow not to lie, for example. So if a person took that vow and then they found themselves having lied, right, then they would do the appropriate thing to sort of confess and sort of address that they made a vow and that person broke their own vow, right? So he's saying there, in that case, follow the appropriate means for each of those sets of vows, because they're each different. And you can study that when you study the vows, which actually some of that's addressed in here later, but each of those sets of vows has its own way of sort of addressing when you break the vow, or damage it, or something like that. So he's saying here, do that. And then he says, he says that, so a downfall means like that you made a vow and you broke the vow. Then he says, negativity should be addressed by means of the four powers. And so by negativities, he means any negative karma, right? So it's now it's no longer unique to vows. It will be any negative karma you create, you use these four powers to purify that. And I want to make a comment about this. So now we're going to get into what are the four powers and how do you practice them. And I just want to say, I mean, I really believe, and I've seen both for myself and also for many other people, that this practice of the four powers is both, it's a means of purifying your karma. It's also a very practical sort of way of changing, actually, of addressing our own lives in a very practical way and changing. This is not just like, I want to be clear, like this four powers is not just some ritual. In other words, it's not like a empty ritual. It's supposed to be, it should be very, and I'll say this, my own view is that the practice of these four powers, and you'll see as we go through them, it's obvious, should be very psychological, actually. In other words, it's working with your own psychology, it's working with your own habits, your own behavior, your own mind. In a very structured, it's like it's a structure in which to work on them, but also it's very individual, and you have to make it apply to yourself and to your own issues. And it has to start. Now it's interesting. This trend. I want to address also something here. The first of the four powers, and I think you can do them in different orders, but they always start with this one. And this translator calls it remorse, which is not a bad translation. I personally prefer another translation that some lamas use, or some translators use, which is intelligent regret. Remorse is okay, but I prefer intelligent regret personally. And I want to say something first of all, like before we even get into that, which is intelligent regret or remorse is not guilt, because sometimes people get them confused. And so I just want to say, and so maybe we'll say, also I'll say what Lama Tsongkhapa says here first. He says the first power is remorse, or intelligent regret, which is regret for the non-virtuous deeds one has done since beginningless time. For it to arise, it is necessary to meditate on the three types of effects, such as the fully ripened ones, and how they're produced through your action. When applying this, you should make use of confessions, such as the Sutra of Golden Light or the 35 Buddhas practice. So I want to explain this a little bit because it's an important. This one. If you don't get this right, the rest of them won't work very deeply. And Lama Tsongkhapa says something very important, which is he says, in other words, he doesn't say look at a list of bad behaviors, right? And then like if your behavior was on that list, feel bad about it. That's not what he says. What he says is think about the effects of your own behavior. Right? That's actually what he says here. And so that's what we have to do in order to develop a kind of intelligent insightful regret. In other words, because when you do a bad behavior, a negativity, right? Think about it for a moment. You're not doing it because you want to be miserable. Right? When you do a negative action, you do it because you think it's going to make you happy. Right? If you yell at somebody, right? You don't yell at them thinking, "Oh, please make me miserable. I'm going to go yell at you." Right? And if you lie, you don't lie thinking, "Oh, I really want to hurt myself, so I'm going to lie to somebody." Right? Actually, oftentimes people lie, right, to like get ahead, or to have somebody not be upset with you, or have somebody like you, or promote you, or whatever, respect you, and so you lie to hide something. Right? So you think, "Oh, this will make me happy." Right? When people sexual misconduct, right? When people have an affair, they don't have an affair thinking, "Oh, let me be miserable." Right? They have an affair thinking, "Oh, I'll be really happy. This will make me happy." Right? Even when people steal, right? They don't steal thinking, "Oh, let me hurt myself." Right? They think, I'll be happy if I have this thing." And so what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying here is, if you do some negativity thinking it's going to make you happy, and then you say, "Oh, I'm bad for doing that," well, that's actually that actually has no real, that's not meaningful. So what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying here is you have to think deeply about why is a negativity, and you have to understand. And what he's saying here is you have to understand because it causes suffering. Right? And if you don't understand that, then the rest of this is not going to work very deeply. Right? And that's the problem. Sometimes people can engage in this practice without thinking deeply about that, and then it doesn't have as much transformative. Still better than not doing anything, I suppose, but it's not very transformative then. Right? And so my point is, going back to my example, like if you shouted at somebody, right? So you have to recognize, okay, when I shouted at them, I thought it was going to make me happy. Or whatever that behavior, all that, there's so many different kinds of negativities, right? And then you have to analyze for yourself, right? Like, so what's the result of that? Right? And you have to check for yourself. Does that make sense? So this is the part where he says it very briefly, but it's actually very important. Right? So you have to contemplate, like, how did it affect my relationship with that person? How did it work out for me? Right? And first of all, he doesn't even mention this. Even in this life, right? If you analyze it, you can see, wow, actually it upset my own mind. Right? It upset their mind. It caused them to suffer. It caused me to suffer. Maybe they weren't as nice to me the next time I saw them, and so on. Right? And then what he gets into here is you also contemplate karma. Right? So when he says, it is necessary to meditate on the 3 types of effects. Right? So remember, those were from earlier in the same chapter. Right? So one is the fully ripened effect. Right? So you would meditate. So you could meditate. First of all, you could meditate on. And we got into this last time. He doesn't even mention this here. One is you can meditate on empathy. Right, how you hurt the other person. Sometimes that's enough to make you actually feel. It's horrible, feel like intelligent regret should be like a visceral experience for yourself. Does that make sense? Not somebody else said it's bad, but a visceral sense. Actually, I'll show you. This is a traditional example, but I'm going to vary it just slightly. The other day, a friend of mine bought some candy because she wanted candy, right? And it was like a diet candy, but she didn't realize if you ate more than like 3 pieces, it had a what's the word, like a laxative effect, yeah. And then she had eaten like 6 pieces instead of 3, and then saw in this very small print, if you eat more than it can have a laxative. It was like, oh no, like my point is, it should be that feeling. Like the feeling, the feeling like that the person has at that moment, like, I didn't read the small print. I didn't know that that if you have more than 2 pieces, you can have a laxative effect. So, like that should be it's a visceral in your gut kind of it's a metaphor here, but it's that kind of. In other words, it's not some moralistic, the Buddha said not to eat too much candy, right? It's, oh no, I'm going to suffer. Or somebody else is going to suffer, or both. Does that make sense? It's like a visceral, felt understanding and insight. That's actually a good example, I think, of what they're getting at here. And so what he's saying here, so there are different kinds of effects. So one is, again, I was getting at, you can just do it based on empathy if you see how much you hurt the person. The second is you could see, like, Shantideva gives examples in the Guides of Bodhisattva's Way of Life with anger, where he talks about, he says like, we get angry thinking we're going to be happy, and then he says, but look at yourself, you can't even sleep at night when you're angry, right? And you have no peace of mind at all, and you think this is going to make you happy, and then other people actually come to hate you. And even the people who you think should like you because you gave them something, some gifts or something like that, if you're angry at them, they don't even want to see you, right? And they try to avoid you. And so, you could do it just based on this life. Then Lama Tsongkhapa says, you could also think about the three types of effects, right? So one is the fully ripened effect, right? So this is karma, right? So you would think, okay, by doing these negative actions, the main effect, the fully ripened effect, is I'll take rebirth in lower realms. Right? Then when I'm finally, then there's the result similar to the cause, right? And there are two types of results similar to the cause. One is, it's like killing, you may have a short life, right, or be ill a lot. Stealing, you won't have enough resources, and so on. Then there's another kind of result similar to the cause, which is you'll tend to do that thing again, right? You develop a habit that then stays with you in this life and in future lives, right? So if you treat other people badly, right, if you treat people with aggression, for example, one is you'll see aggression back, right, from other people in this life and future lives. Another kind of result similar to the cause is that you'll continue to treat people with aggression, on and on, in this life and in future lives, and then you'll never become enlightened as long as you do that, right? You'll never even have good relationships as long as you do. And then there are environmental results, right? Like, so you'll be born in a place, or your environment will reflect those kinds of karmas, those kind of qualities, and so on, right? And so Lama Tsongkhapa is saying, there are so many ways, actually, I just want to point this out, right? There are so many ways to contemplate. And this is what His Holiness the Dalai Lama so often points out, right? We have to use reason, right? Because ordinarily we're actually unreasonable. And again, it's easy to think other people are unreasonable, right? What's hard is to recognize one's own lack of reasonableness, lack of being a reasonable person. But that's what this is, actually. So you have to think, okay, I thought I'd be happy by lying, for example, right? But actually, what does lying do to me, and to other people, right? What does it do to my relationships? What does it do to me in this life? What does it do to me in future lives? What kind of karma is that? And what are the results of that? And you have to keep contemplating until you feel a sense of, oh, wow, what was I thinking? Like, I thought I'd be happy by doing that, but I'm actually, Shantideva, again, I'm quoting Shantideva, he says, although they want to be happy, they run towards the causes of suffering. Although they don't want to suffer, they run towards the causes of suffering. Although they want to be happy, they destroy the causes of happiness, right? That they is us, right? Whereas he's referring to people like me, And so we're contemplating that here and recognizing, oh wow, so today, when I reacted to somebody in this way, I thought I was trying to be happy, and wow, I created a cause of more suffering. And you contemplate until you get that feeling of, oh, wow, that's like, I don't want to do that, because I created suffering for myself and others. I don't, until it becomes a visceral feeling. And so that first one, in a way, Khenpo Rinpoche pointed this out. He said, all the other powers kind of flow from that and come naturally. If you develop this one, this insight, I'm going to call it an insight, right? That's why I like the word intelligent for grit. It should be an insight. Does that make sense? It shouldn't be like guilt. And it certainly shouldn't be an identification, like, oh, I'm a bad person. That's not the point of this, right? The point of this, that's why I use the analogy of eating too many of the wrong kind of a laxative, candy that has a laxative. You don't think, oh, that's who I am. Like, you think, oh, I ate the wrong thing. So you don't identify, like, it doesn't, the idea here is not shame, right? To become, like, where it becomes like you're some sense of, this is who I am. And it's not like something of beating yourself up and sort of, it's, the analogy that they sometimes give is it's like if somebody realizes they just ingested poison, they want to vomit it out, actually. Right? It is before it affects the person, right? So you don't think it's me, you think this is something I want to get out of me, actually, that has nothing to do with my basic nature. Does that make sense? I just want to clarify that, because sometimes people have that wrong, people make a mistake at this point. And when they start to develop intelligent regret, instead they sort of develop some sense of like, I don't know what the word is, like self-attack or self-hatred or something like that. That's not the point at all. Actually, this is a form of self-compassion. right? And I want to give one more analogy. I just want to make one more point there. This is like, as you're doing this one, notice how you talk to yourself, right? And it, like, if you're being mean to yourself and insulting yourself, that's not intelligent regret, that's stupid. That's self-destructive, that's mean. And the tone of this kind of intelligent regret should be, like, I don't know if you've had this experience, but I'll just share it. Like, again, I'm going off on my own tangent for a moment here, but I think it's an important point. You know, if a friend of yours, if your best friend tells you they did something foolish, right? Like, you know, everybody can make a foolish mistake, and if your best friend really trusts you, right, they might say, oh, yesterday I said this thing to somebody. I feel so embarrassed. Like, I can't believe I said that. Now, to them, you would, I hope, you wouldn't say, wow, you're an idiot. I don't like you, you know. if that's what you say, it's not a good plan. That's not being a good friend, right? On the other hand, you wouldn't say, oh, it's no big deal, just do it again. You know, like, you know, just keep doing that, right? You would say, like, you would be supportive while also supporting them and not doing that again, right? Realizing, well, if you regret it, great, that's a good insight. Don't ever do that again then, you know, like, and even if you see that your friend, if it's like, there are a lot of people you might not tell, but somebody who really trusts you, right, who you really love, and if you see they're making a terrible mistake, right, well, you tell them, right, but you don't tell them in a mean way, right, you say to them, like, you might say what, like, you know, hey, listen, I don't want you to suffer, so please don't do that. Let me explain why I think you'll suffer if you do that, because I care about you, and I don't want to see you hurt yourself, right? That's the tone you should have here. Does that make sense? A tone of self-compassion, actually, right? Where you're like, as if you were talking to your best friend and you're seeing, oh, you're going to do something that hurts you. Please don't do that. I love you. I don't want to see you hurt yourself. You know, please think differently. See, look at it this way. You know, so you get what I'm saying. I just want to explain that because I think people sometimes get that wrong in that sense and become like self-attacking. But it should be that, okay? So the tone of this should be, think of the person you love the most in the world in the sense of kindness, like really cherish, right? With a feeling of loving kindness. That should, and what you would say to them, the tone of this should be like that. Like, you know, it's sort of like, oh, please don't do that. You're going to suffer. You know, like, I don't want to see you suffer. You know, like that, right? But you're saying it to yourself in this case, which is good because you're the person most likely to listen to you, hopefully. Any questions about the power of intelligent regret? Is that pretty clear about how to do it? So then, there are different orders in which the next three powers are presented, but I'll just follow the order that Lama Tsongkhapa presents it in. Sometimes one goes next to the last one, but I'll just do it in this order. So what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying here is, having generated intelligent regret, the next thing to do is to apply an antidote. And what really the idea is here is if you've done something negative, with the motivation of purifying that, or reversing the energy of that, or reversing the karma of that, or applying an antidote to that, you do a positive action. Does that make sense? So whatever, if you recognize I just did a negative action, you do, at this point, specifically in order to sort of counteract the effect of that, you specifically and with intentionality do a positive action. Some commentaries say any positive action will do at this point. You know, so for example, some commentaries will say, like, you know, if you hurt somebody and you want to purify it, you can go help somebody. You know, that's an option, obviously. Here, Lama Tsongkhapa specifically, he doesn't get into that. He gives, I think six examples of Buddhist Dharma practices you can do at that point to counteract that effect. So I'll just go through the ones he mentions. So the first one is, he says, the first of these six as a kind of, and you don't have to do all of them, you pick one, or, you know, that you're going to focus on for a period of time, or for that particular instance. But he says, is to absorb the words of the sets of sutras like the Perfection of Wisdom sutras, retain them, read them, and so forth. So what he's saying there is one way to purify this is to memorize sutras, teachings of the Buddha, and recite them as a kind of antidote. And if you can't memorize the whole thing, you can memorize parts, or you can read it, you know, you can read it too, but, and so like, and if you, like for example, the Diamond Cutter Sutra, the Vajra Cutter Sutra, it actually says it could be used as a means of purification. And also earlier he mentioned the Sutra of Golden Light, which we sometimes read at the center. There's a whole chapter on confession. Sometimes people memorize that chapter or read that as part of their purification practice. But so one option is you can pick a sutra that resonates for you, one of these traditional sutras that are used. Some people use parts of the sutra, there's a perfection of wisdom in 8,000 verses. There are many different sutras of the Buddha, and sometimes people will memorize or keep them and read part of them as part of their practice to purify. So that's one option. A second option that he mentions, excuse me, is to meditate, he says, to engage in the reality that is selflessness and clear light, and to be convinced about primordial purity, which is interesting. What he's saying there is to meditate on emptiness, actually, the ultimate nature of phenomena, including yourself. But he chooses an interesting way to put it there. He says, to be convinced about primordial purity. I want to just say something very brief about that, which is, first of all, the teachings actually say that meditation on the nature of reality, right? In Buddhism, we use the word shunyata, or emptiness, to label that, as a word to label what that ultimate nature is. Or clear light. But I think Lama Tsongkhapa's choice of words here, selflessness, clear light, primordial purity, are interesting. Because what he's saying is, there are many teachings that say that. There is, when you meditate on emptiness, there's a sense in which, this word, emptiness is unstained, is primordially pure, they sometimes use the word clear light to describe emptiness. And so I think one is they say that meditation on emptiness, or even, Khensa Rinpoche often quotes many sutras like this that say even just being curious about emptiness, or wondering about emptiness, and so on, is one of the most powerful ways of purifying karma. There's a famous line from Arya Deva that says, even having a doubt about emptiness tears samsara to shreds. But also Lama Tsongkhapa chooses the word primordial purity, right? I think there's an implication there, to me, at least as I read that, which is like, if you're tending to identify with your negativity, right, he's saying, no, your nature is primordially pure. So if you meditate on emptiness, it's recognizing, let's sort of say this, that no negativity can stain your ultimate nature. Your ultimate nature is unstained, actually, is clear light. So there's no way to, to say I am my negativity, because those negativities are, adventitious is sometimes the translation word they use, but they're arisen due to causes and conditions. Right? And the ultimate nature of who you are and of your mind is primordial purity, is clear light. And so meditating on that is an antidote to the negativities. Another one, it says here, third one, based on recitation. He gives the example of the 100th syllable one, right, which means the mantra of Vajrasattva. And this is a practice, I'll just mention, that's a practice that many people do every day, is recite, in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, and all the Tibetan Buddhist traditions, is to recite the Vajrasattva mantra. And so and Vajrasattva is a tantric sort of form of the Buddha, whose sort of body is sort of like crystalline, translucent light, white light colored. And he symbolizes primordial purity, in a way, the primordial purity of your own nature. And sometimes people recite his mantra every day as part of their purification practice, and they visualize white nectar and light descending into them and purifying their negativities. So that's another option. And Lama Tsongkhapa quotes a tantra, because I just said Vajrasattva is a tantric form of the Buddha. That's actually interesting. It says, just as the flames of the forest in spring, uncontained, burn all the underbrush, ethics winds fan the fires of recitation, burning evil with the flames of great joyous effort. It's a pretty poem, right? Just as the sun strikes snow with rays of light, which overwhelm do not withstand its brilliance, when ethics rays recitation strike the snow of negativities, it is exhausted. Just as taking out a butter lamp in the darkness dispels the darkness so there's nothing left, the darkness of evil collected in thousands of lives is quickly dispelled by the lamp of recitation. That's quite beautiful, isn't it? So he's saying just like the snow melting when the sun hits it, or just like brush being burned away, our negativities will be burned away. And I'll just say one more point there. Again, I'm just being a little psychological here for a moment, but I think there's a reason why Lama Tsongkhapa quotes that. I'll say, like, last December I led like a 7-day retreat in California on Vajrasattva practice, doing the 4 powers. And I said, there's a point in the practice of Vajrasattva, after you do the power of regret, and you do the mantra recitation, and you visualize nectar pouring into you, where it says, now Vajrasattva says to you, basically, all of your negative karmas and negativities and faults are completely purified. And I said to the group of students, I said, I think for most of you that will be the hardest part of this practice, is to believe that. Anybody can say mantra, right? Anybody can maybe, try to visualize it. But to imagine even that you're pure, right? That you yourself are purified. Many people find a hard time psychologically. They feel, oh no, I'm flawed. My nature is flawed. I'm just so limited. I'm so bad. I'm so, what's the word? Faulty, or so unworthy, or so, like a sense of not being good enough. And so I'm not making it up, right? Lama Tsongkhapa quotes this tantra, right? He's saying, that's the idea, right? That you feel like you yourself. It's not saying somebody else, right? He's saying, my negativities were burned away like the fire burned the underbrush. My negativities are like the glacier that melted, right? Not a glacier, but what do you call it? Like, in spring, like when there's a bunch of snow and the sun hits it in the springtime and it melts and it's all gone, right? To feel my negativities are like that. It's actually sometimes hard to feel that. And Lama Tsongkhapa here is saying, that's how you should feel if you do this practice, Vajrasattva practice. You should actually cultivate the sense of, wow, I've been purified. And he says, and practice it until you receive the signs of purification. And he mentions them, vomiting bad food, or vomiting out things, or seeing the sun and the moon traveling in the sky, or seeing fire burning, or standing buffalo attacks, or seeing sangha or monks or nuns, climbing a tree from which milk emerges, an elephant, a bull, a mountain, a lion throne, or a fine house, or hearing the Dharma in your dreams. He's saying if you receive those signs, then really, actually you can feel, you should stop and feel, okay, that's the sign, I've succeeded, I've purified my negativities. And really kind of let that go. Then of course your job is not to do it again, that's a different issue, but we'll get to it in a minute. But you get what I'm getting at here? What he's saying is, do these practices and then let it go. And feel, identify with your Buddha nature, your primordial purity, your clear light nature. Anyway, he goes on with other practices you can do. Another one is based on images. So it says to create images of the Buddha, having gained faith in him. That can either include, sponsoring the making of a tanka or a statue if you want to, like, for your altar or for somebody else. Or it can be, there are these, we have some here, there are like molds, and you can, with clay, and you can make your own, they call them satsas, these little Buddha images. So sometimes people will do that practice as their method of purification. They'll do the 4 powers, and they'll use clay or whatever, and make these Buddha images, and that's a practice. Another option, he says, is making offerings to the Buddhas or to stupas. Then he says another option is based on the names. And what that means is, like, so for example, there are different different Buddhas names that can be recited. So there's a traditional practice actually that comes from that Lama Tsongkhapa himself emphasized in his own life, which was there were 35 Buddhas who made vows. In the future, when they were bodhisattvas, they said, when I become a Buddha, anyone who recites my name will receive this benefit and this purification. And they sort of did extensive practice. And so it's a very beautiful kind of poetic practice from the sutra. So there's a tradition of doing prostrations while reciting the names of those 35 Buddhas. So that's an example of this. Or there are other Buddhas' names that one can recite. There are many different lists of Buddhas' names, and people can memorize them and recite them as a method of purification. Okay, so those are the ones he mentions. As I said, other commentaries say you can do other positive actions, but the idea is that so the first power, right, is intelligent regret, which drives the entire thing. The second power that Lama Tsongkhapa lists, I'll call it the power of the antidote. So it's doing something positive, right? And he gives these examples of Dharma practices to do, to purify our negativity. And then the third one is also quite important, obviously, now we're going to get to the third of the four powers. So the third power is the power of preventing faults in the future. And Lama Tsongkhapa lists here, he says, first he says, so we have to restrain ourselves. In other words, and you can see that. In other words, if you say, oh, through my action of hatred, I created so much suffering, I really regret it, but I don't care if I do it again in 5 minutes. Something hasn't worked right in your power of intelligent regret, right? Because if you really generate intelligent regret, then this comes from that. And insight leads to not wanting to do the action again. And Lama Tsongkhapa says, he says you can do this in relation to the 10 non-virtuous actions, which were taught earlier in the section on karma. And then he says, any action done to afflictive obscurations and obscurations to the Dharma are destroyed. And then he mentions specifically, he says, you can do intelligent regret, you can do, restraint in relation to actions you yourself have done, things you've caused others to do, or things you've rejoiced in. And remember, because those are different ways of creating negative actions, right? One is to go, there are many examples of this, right? But one is to do violence, for example, yourself. Right? That's obviously a negative action. But another version of negativity is encouraging somebody else to do violence. So if I'm too lazy, but I'm filled with hatred, right? I can inspire somebody else to go treat somebody badly and hurt them. That's my negative karma also. Does that make sense? It's not, just because I didn't do it physically doesn't mean I didn't create the negative karma if I inspired somebody else. And the third one is rejoicing, right? And that's it's an easy way to create good karma, but it's also an easy way to create a lot of bad karma. And there are many examples of that, but what they're saying is if you rejoice, if you feel joy in somebody else doing virtuous things and positive things, you create good karma just through rejoicing. Right? Because remember, karma is mainly created by the mind. Right? So if I see somebody else acting with great compassion, and I think, wow, that's so inspiring, that's wonderful, that's beautiful. I feel like how wonderful that people are doing that. Just by that joy, I'm accumulating karma. But the point here is that he's talking about negative karma. So for example, it's very easy to do. They call it negative rejoicing, right? So for example, if you watch, this happens oftentimes in times of conflict, right? Where somebody can watch, for example, somebody turns on the TV and they see people being bombed, right? And if it's your country's doing the bombing, and if you say, oh, yes, that's awesome, right? And you're feeling really happy that people are being killed, right? That's an easy way to create a lot of negative karma, right? To rejoice in sort of killing, in my case, right? You can even do that, though, even if you don't like somebody, whether it be the leader of another country, another country's leader, or a political candidate, or something of that sort. And if something terrible happens to them and you think, oh, that's great, I hope more terrible things happen to them. That'd be an example of negative rejoicing. Doesn't mean you can't stand up for things, but that's different than rejoicing in somebody's pain and misery. So it's two different things. And then he says the importance of sincere restraint, right? So he says here, I just wanted to read this. Confession without a sincere mind of restraint is nothing but words. Therefore, the mind of restraint of doing nothing of not doing it henceforth is important. Its development also depends. This is what I was saying. So, in other words, to develop a mind of restraint depends on the real insight of intelligent regret. Right? And I think it's an important point, right? He says, if there's not some mind of wishing to restrain, then your regret and all the rest of this was just mere word. It was like, oh yeah, I'm sorry I did that, but it doesn't have any meaning. Right? It's the same. We know that actually, right? Whereas if somebody comes up to you and they say to you, I'm sorry I did that, and you say, well, will you not do it again? They say, no, I'm not committing not to do it again. I might do it again tomorrow, but I'm sorry I did it, right? How do you feel? Actually, we say that, right? We say, that's not a real apology. They don't see what they did wrong even, right? You know, sometimes that happens. Like people will say, "Oh yeah, I'm sorry," just because they want you to shut up or something, right? Like, but it's not a real apology. They don't really get it that they did something hurtful, right? And so what it's saying is, don't be like that. Whereas that's not real purification. That's just words. Right? We have to really see: am I creating suffering? And if I am, then of course I want to change. So that's what Lama. So this depends on really understanding the intelligent regret, having that insight and that visceral experience. One thing Lama Tsongkhapa doesn't mention here, but the oral tradition says, so I'll just add it in at this point, is what they say is that ideally, you know, when you're doing the 4 powers of purification, you would commit and restrain to never do the action again. That's the ideal form of this. But then they acknowledge something. They acknowledge that when it comes to big negative actions that you can just avoid, that you're capable of avoiding, that's great. The oral tradition points out, sometimes the lamas in the oral tradition will point out, if it's something that you do, let's say there's a negative action like that you're tending to do 20 or 30 times a day, right? Then it may not, then even if you have an insight that that's destructive, the reality is you may not be capable of saying, I'll never do that again. If you've been in the habit of doing something over and over and over, right? And so what they say then is, at least at this point, make a power of restraint that's realistic to who you are. Does that make sense? So you may say, okay, I won't do it for 24 hours. As a sort of, I'm going to start, like building, not like lazy, I want to be clear, not like lazily, like, okay, I'll take a break for 24 hours and then I'll go back to it. But a sense of like, okay, I'm going to work on this. And I'm going to try to get better. You know, and I'm going to really, how long can I really push myself to be aware? And then, you know, maybe the next time I'll do 48 hours and I'll build up or something like that. So it would be clear, if it's like a time-limited restraint, that's not out of like some sense of, oh, well, I can do whatever I want, right? Or something like some cavalier attitude. In other words, you have to be realistic. The point here is like, you know, again, it's compassion. It's actually self-compassion, right? Like, I'll actually say that. Like, I'll give an example, actually. I'm just giving an example. Because this point about restraint, we have to be wise and compassionate to ourselves. And I'll give an example. Like, you know, I work my job. I work as a therapist, psychologist. And, you know, if somebody were to, actually sometimes that happens where somebody will say to me, they have a real insight. And they say, wow, this thing I've been doing, this way I've been relating to people is terrible. It causes me so much suffering. You know, I have a new goal. I'm never going to do that again. Right? And if I think the person can do that, of course I say, that's wonderful. What a great idea, right? But on the other hand, like if I see, wow, but this person's been doing that like every time they interact with somebody. And if they say they're never going to do it again as of this moment, and if I believe the chances of them succeeding in that are 0, but if I honestly believe it, then I would say, well, you know, in other words, that's a great goal. How can you start? What's a realistic beginning? You know, because there is and I would say to them, actually, like, and I'm saying because we would say this to ourselves, right? What I would say to them oftentimes, I say this to myself too, is like, well, don't set a goal that you're then going to be discouraged about. Like, oh, I'm never going to do it again, and then you do it tomorrow, and then you say, oh, I'm terrible, and I give up. Right? That's not helpful. So, like, set a realistic goal, and then build on that. You know, so like, I'm going to, you know, like, and then gain momentum, and then eventually you can reach the point where you never do it again, you know. Does that make sense? So I'm just saying, like, we have to be wise and skillful with ourselves at this point. And saying, how can I really change and really transform? And I think if you do that, that's like very profound. Does that make sense? Like that's how people really change, isn't it? Is the intelligent regret, right? Where you really see, wow, what I'm doing isn't working. It's really causing misery. And then how do I change, right? Because it's like, I think it's actually, I'll just say, like, to say, like Lama Tsongkhapa says it, right? On the one hand, to just say, oh, I'm not going to bother changing. I'm not going to bother restraining myself. Then it's just words, right? But at the same time, like, we have to know ourselves and progress step by step. Right? So as Dalai Lama points out, right? He says, like, he gives these examples. He says, if you're progressing in your Dharma practice, he says the duration and the intensity and the frequency should get less, right? And he gives the example, if I used to scream at people like every day for hours, and now like, you know, maybe I only scream once a week and it's only for a few minutes and then I kind of apologize, that's huge progress, you know, and like, you should recognize that as progress. It doesn't mean it's good to scream once a week and have to apologize, but like, to recognize that's progress, and I can get, if I've made that much progress, then a year from now I could not be doing that even, you know? Like, so we have to sort of be realistic. Does that make sense? And that's, I think, important for this one. But you get the idea, it's also not like, it's not to do it, because, I want to be clear though, it's also not to just make it some empty ritual, like, okay, for 5 minutes, what's the word, like, yeah, I lie a lot, and so for 5 minutes, right before I go to sleep, when I'm not talking to anybody anyway, I won't lie, and, that was my restraint, right? Then it's like an empty ritual or something that has no meaning, right? But on the other hand, if you say, well, I've tended to lie a lot, and my awareness is not so good, but I could be aware, like tomorrow, if I always lie at a certain kind of interaction, whatever, like when at business meetings, or when I see my family, or when I whatever, I can do it for this visit, or I can do it for the first hour of this visit, and then like the next day I'll do it for 2 hours or something, or I'm gonna, you see what I mean? Like, and I'm gonna be aware, and I'm gonna really like work on that, and in that way I can say, okay, so maybe in a year I could actually reach a point where I never do it, but, so you have to know yourself. Does that make sense? And like, that's about that power of restraint. Let me pause there. Any questions? So those are 3 out of the 4 powers. There's one more still to go. Any questions about those?
There is one more power? I thought you covered all 4 of them.
No, that's 3. So the first was intelligent regret. The second was I call it the power of the antidote, like so a Dharma practice. The third was restraint. And there's one more, which is the power of support, he calls it.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, so there's one more.
How do you tell if it worked really well?
Like the purification practice?
Yeah, when you get to the end, I mean.
Like,
But I'll wait.
Okay, yeah, actually he addresses that a little bit. So ask again if that isn't answered in the next section, then ask again. Because he addresses that some, so I should let it. We'll see how Lama Tsongkhapa answers it, and if that's not complete enough, then I can add more. Or explain more or something. I shouldn't add to Lama Tsongkhapa. I can try to explain it. But yeah, any questions about
so
those?
the second one, applying antidote, where does the negativity go? The negative action you commit, I mean, you see, the intelligence regret, you say about your negativity, and then you apply the antidote. So where does that stuff you're regretting go? I mean, where does?
Like Lama Tsongkhapa later says, he gives an example, actually, where he says, or a metaphor or something, an analogy, where he says, if you have a seed, right, like let's say you have a seed for a plant, and then he points out, if you burn that seed, right, like even if you partially burn it, actually, it won't sprout. And so he uses that as the example. He says, so the karma, it's not that you like, so the analogy there is like, you can stop it from being able to function. Does that make sense? So like, it's not that you can go back in time and say, like if you yelled at somebody yesterday and then you do the 4 powers of purification, it's not that then you didn't yell at them, right? You did. But you can change the karma so that it doesn't ripen in the same way. That's what does that make sense? And that's a good analogy. Like, so it's like if you, he uses that. If you burn the seed, it won't sprout. Okay, well, I'll just continue on because it seems like then maybe it'll help answer people's questions. So then the 4th power, Lama Tsongkhapa only, he covers this one pretty briefly, but he says, is to take refuge and cultivate the mind of enlightenment, bodhicitta. And again, I'll just explain a little bit more about that. So the power of support. The commentary says the reason why they call it a support is this, is that, so this is the 4th, if you're doing the full practice, you would include this one also. And the idea of support is that you say, if you want to get up, right, you have to get up based on the earth itself, right, or whatever you're standing on, right. If you're standing on a floor, you can only get up based on the support of the floor itself, right. And what the commentaries say is that we create our negative karma in relationships, because remember, one of the key Buddhist ideas is interdependence, right? We're interdependent with others, in a sense. And so the nature of our interdependence is such that our negative karma that we've created, almost all of it is created in relationships with others, right? We point out you can't lie if there's not somebody to lie to, right? You remember the teaching on lying? Like you have to identify who you're going to lie to, and you're trying to change their mind, right? You're trying to make them believe something that's not true. Right? If you're going to steal, you have to steal from, somebody else has to own it, or else it's not stealing, and so on. And so the idea here is that we create our negative karma in relationship to enlightened beings or in relation to ordinary, suffering beings like us. And so here, as the part of the, and we do that in a, what's how you say this, with a negative motivation, right? Like either, we went through that. All negativities are created with a bad motivation, a destructive motivation. That's the nature of a negativity, right? And so here you're creating a positive relationship and a positive motivation in relation to enlightened beings and ordinary beings. So the enlightened beings is refuge. So you're developing a sense of, what's the word? Faith, right? And trust and reliance upon enlightened beings. Out of fear of your own and others' suffering, or concern, or fear of your own and others' suffering, you develop a mind of reliance, trust, faith in the enlightened beings. And then the mind of enlightenment, bodhicitta, right? You relate to others with compassion. And what that's doing is it's the exact opposite. In other words, when you create negative karma in relation to somebody else, it's not out of compassion. It's out of some afflictive emotion. And so here we're intentionally creating a positive motivation in relation to others, which again is the exact opposite of what we did when we created the negative karma. So you can see how it's sort of purifying. It's transforming, or it's reversing the negative karmic tendency. So that's the fourth power, is you take refuge and you generate bodhicitta, motivation. And then Lama Tsongkhapa makes some general points that partly answer your question, see. So the first thing he says is, the victor, meaning the Buddha, said that there are various ways for beginners to purify negativities. However, the thoroughly complete antidote is the four powers in their entirety. So what he's saying is, sometimes beginners will just do part of the practice. They'll may recite a prayer, they may just do the mantra, Vajrasattva, or say the names of Buddhas. And he's saying that's good, but if you really want to effectively purify, you need to practice all four powers together as an effective practice. And you can see how they go together, right? Whereas if you just say the names, if you just say some mantra, but you don't have the regret, if you don't have the, not just regret, but the intelligent insight regret, right? Then it's okay to say mantras, there's nothing bad about that, but you won't really change, right? Whereas you're not going to change your behavior and your mental attitudes if you don't understand. And really transformation, and this is Dalai Lama often points this out, right? Whereas real Buddhist practice comes with understanding ourself and our experience and what we're doing and our relationships and our interrelatedness with others and how that's functioning. And it's not enough just to do a ritual, really. And sometimes, one time I remember this quote, Lama Tsongkhapa said, he said something like, don't stop doing the little bit of Dharma practice you pretend to do, but it'd be better if you actually practice Dharma, which I thought was a good point. And so in a way, that's what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying here, is he's saying, for beginners, whatever you try to pretend to do is better than doing nothing at all. But eventually you have to really do the practice of understanding your negativities, therefore actually wanting to restrain from them. Doing Dharma practices in order to sort of get the energy that change your karma and so on, and take refuge in bodhicitta and all. He's saying you have to really do that if you really want to purify. But if you're not up for that yet, then pretend to do whatever you can pretend to do. Then he addresses the question you guys were asking somewhat. He said, or one of the questions, he says, the manner in which negativities are purified is as follows. Right? So now he's saying, how does it work? And then he points out something. There actually says this in sutras, so there are a number of things he points out. One is, he says, now he's getting at how does it actually work in real people's lives? Does that make sense? And in real people's lifetimes. And he says, so he's making various points. One is that it depends, actually I'm going to do it in a different order here. He's pointing out something like this. It depends on your own practice, first of all, right? So what I want to go down to the bottom here. He says, if you do the four powers very intensely, of course that's different than if you do them half-heartedly. He says, if you do them for a long time, that's different than if you do them for a little while. He's saying if you do them in a very complete way versus in a sort of incomplete way, and how much in your heart, how deeply your heart is in it, all that. He says, of course, so I guess my point is, if you think of it this way, say a group of people are sitting there, like I led that retreat, for example, right? So there were, I don't know, all these people were sitting there, and everybody was doing the same, everybody was sitting there, in the same kind of some people in a chair, some on the floor, it didn't matter, right? Everybody was doing the same thing. But what he's saying is how much purification you get out of that, how much you actually change, is up to you, right? And that's true of everything, right? What does it say? What you put into it is what you get out of it, that kind of thing, right? And so what he's saying is like, if you practice very intensively for a long time, or if you like really practice with your whole heart, the effect of that practice on your karma will be different than somebody who practices only half-heartedly. And so on. And the same thing, if you practice a little bit and then you say, oh, I'm too busy, that's good, but that's not as good as somebody who makes more time to practice. You know, it's like, it's going to affect you how much you put into it. And then he points out, so depending on those kinds of factors, he's saying, for some people, they could have like some big negative karma that would have resulted in lifetimes of suffering, and instead it will just manifest as a headache. He gives the example there, a mere headache, right? Or so like, then the sign of success in your practice would be you get a headache. Say, oh, great, I'm doing good, you know, I'm making progress in my purification, I got a headache, how wonderful. There's actually a line in the Vajra Cutter Sutra, Diamond Cutter, Vajra Cutter Sutra, that says something like that. I can't remember the exact words, but it basically says, like, if you, basically it says, it doesn't use these exact words, but it basically says, if you study and understand and practice this practice, which is teaching emptiness, that sutra, it says if you practice this sutra well, difficulties will arise. And it says that's a sign of progress. And it's getting at this point, that if you have a lot of your negative karma, one sign of progress is it starts to manifest in small experiences of difficulty. And what it's saying then is embrace those. Don't, it's saying this, which is a core Buddhist practice anyways, don't reject what actually arises, including the difficulties of life, but face them bravely and sort of engage with life in a deep way. And then it's saying other people, if you do enough practice, so it's saying sometimes it manifests as a mere headache. Other times it manifests as something, a brief experience that would have been much longer. For other people, it may not be experienced at all, and just is sort of completely, like a seed that's completely burnt and can't ripen at all. And so what he's saying here is that's very individual, depending on the intensity of your practice and also depending on what the karma was. But there's an important point that's implied here, or actually I guess it's said a little lower, but any negative, according to Buddhism, any negative karma can be purified and completely purified. That's an important point. And there are traditional stories like, probably there are two that are often told. One is Anguli Mala, which actually the word Anguli Mala, mala is like a rosary, right? We say, oh, this is a mala. Right? But Anguli means finger. So he had a mala made of fingers. And he was trying to collect 108, I think it was, because that's the traditional number. He was like a serial killer, right, actually. And he had killed 107 people, I believe it was. I think I got that number right. And then he met the Buddha, and that was going to be his 108th. And they say that, actually I'll just tell the story, it's kind of funny. But they say, he decided he's going to be my last one, and when I get his finger, then I'll be enlightened. He had some idea if I kill 108 people, I'll be enlightened. And he started chasing the Buddha. And they say the Buddha was walking, and Angulimala was running, but he somehow couldn't catch him. And he said, stop! Like Angulimala yelled at the Buddha, stop! And the Buddha turned to him with great compassion and said, something like, I don't know what his words were, but basically, dear, you have to stop. And Angulimala suddenly realized that he wasn't just saying stop running. He was saying stop being a murderer, you know. And somehow, like, Angulimala changed and the Buddha became his teacher and he taught him. And they say that in that lifetime, Angulimala became an arhat, somebody completely liberated from samsara. And the point is they use that story as an example that there is no negativity that can't be purified through effort. And then Angulimala made great effort in his practice and he succeeded in his practice of becoming an arhat. Anyway, so the point is, any negativity, you know, I think it's good to have an example like Angulimala, because you can say, well, okay, at least I'm not a mass murderer. You know? So if he can do it, I can do it. You know, Tibetans have Milarepa, right? Like who was the first, they say that Milarepa was the first person, there were other Tibetans who became enlightened, but they say he was the first person to go from being a completely ordinary person to being a Buddha in one lifetime in Tibet. Like other people were already like quite advanced, you know, and they continued on the path. But Milarepa, they say in his early part of his life, he actually used black magic and killed people. Right? It's actually a great story if you read his biography. It's a wonderful story. But he actually killed people, and then he became a Buddha in that lifetime, like Angulimala. So the point is, like, I mean, there are many points to that story, but one point of that story is anything can be purified. But it just depends on the intensity of your practice. Now, Milarepa practiced very, very intensely. You read his story, and he was off in the caves, and he went through a lot of hard. His teacher also, actually, he had this thing about the mere headache version. His teacher, Marpa, said, oh, if I give him the teachings right away, he has so much negative karma, it won't work. And so he put him through all kinds of difficult, his teacher sort of put him through all these hard times. And other people thought, why is Marpa doing that? He's usually very compassionate, but he seems like he's being hard on this guy. He's got to be mean. But Marpa knew that was the way to help purify Milarepa's karma and his heart and make him ready for the teachings. And then it said that once Marpa taught him the teachings, he made very quick progress. Went through a lot of difficult times still, but became enlightened in one life. So the point is that whatever we've done can be purified. That's a basic Buddhist tenet, because you have Buddha nature. Your basic nature, as using Lama Tsongkhapa's words from earlier, is clear light, primordial purity. So you can purify. Then it says, then Lama Tsongkhapa addresses a question. He says, some sutras and the Vinaya, right, the teachings on monasticism, say, quote, actions are not lost, even in 100 eons. So he says, some people could read that, which he said earlier, right? Karma is not lost. Karma is definite, and so on. It doesn't get lost even in over eons. And he says, so then how can it be purified, right? He's raising a doubt that somebody can have. And then Lama Tsongkhapa says, well, that quote is true if you don't apply an antidote. And he's saying, but if you do apply an antidote, then it can be purified. So he's saying, if there's not a countermeasure, then karma will bring its effect. But karma is dependently arisen, right? It's a dependent arising. And so, like any dependent arising, it can be, other causes and conditions can block it. And then he says, it's the same with positive karma, right? And he says that also positive karma can, so for example, like if you create positive karma, it can also be harmed if you do some terrible things. And if you do negative karma, it can be harmed if you do the 4 powers. So he's saying you can reverse your karma. And then he says, that's where he's down here. He says, so wrong views and anger can, just as wrong views and anger or hatred can harm or like, so you could do a positive action. It says this in Shantideva's Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, for example. It says if somebody does a lot of positive actions and then develops extreme hatred, right? It's not that it undoes those positive actions, they were done, but that hatred stops it from ripening, right? Because hatred is so destructive that it stops the positive karma from ripening. And it says in the same way, if you've done very bad negative actions, but you do these 4 powers, it will stop them from ripening. And then he goes into this point about that it's like burning a seed. Right? And that if you burn a seed, it won't bear fruit, even though the seed, even though the action happened. And then he makes one more point that I'll sort of go over here. He makes one more point that I think is worth mentioning, which is he says then, if you do intensive purification practice, you can actually burn that seed. You can make it such that that negative karma will not ripen and won't bring a suffering effect. And then he says, but still that's not the same as not having done the action at all. And he makes a couple of points about that I just think are, he makes it, it's worth mentioning here. So one point he makes is that even if you could do like great purification practice and you can succeed in actually purifying the negative karma. And then he says, but still, for example, having done that so in that sense it won't ripen in a suffering effect, right? If you succeeded at purifying it won't ripen as some lower realm or some horrible suffering. He says, but still it can become an obstacle to you progressing on the path. That's one problem, right? Or so you can succeed in purifying, but it can still slow down it's not that you won't eventually become enlightened, but he's saying it can slow down your progress still. So he says, so if you make mistakes, purify it, right? And then he's saying, but better still, better yet, is don't make the mistakes in the first place if at all possible. Does that make sense? So he's just making that point here. And then he makes, I think somewhere here he makes an analogy, that if you break a bone and then you set it and it heals, that's good, but it's not as good as never having broken the bone in the first place, right? And that's true, isn't it? I was reading something about that, like as you get, they were pointing out that as you get older, like, so people who broke bones when they were young, and then they sort of, I don't know, if it heals, they can feel quite strong again, but then of course as they age, sometimes the effects of the previous break is still there, and it's weaker than their other arm, or their other ankle, or their other knee, or whatever. And so he's saying it's like that, that you can heal, but it's still better, and it allows you to progress faster on the path if you don't do the negativities in the first place. So he's saying, so try to do that as best you can. Right? And he gives examples of how it can slow down your progress on the path. So let me pause there and see. So that kind of, then there's something more general about the attitude of lesser beings. So let's pause there for a moment. Any questions about the 4 powers of purification? Did that answer your question or not?
Yeah, I was also wondering if you'd be consciously aware of the karma disappearing from your life. Because this stuff would affect afflictions, right? I mean, you wouldn't have much attachment, or would you be consciously aware of the attachment being broken? It's like it's going away. You say, oh, thank God, that doesn't bother me anymore. It's kind of gone from your life.
Yeah, so there are more signs, actually. I'll answer your question more fully now. Like, one is, he talks about, like, if you have certain of these dreams, that's a sign that you've purified. If something manifests in a certain way, you can say, oh, wow, that's a sign of purification. But actually, the core one that he doesn't go into here, but actually it's taught many times, and Lama Tsongkhapa himself taught it in other places, is the most important sign of purification is that you make progress on the path, exactly like you're saying. In other words, that your mental afflictions decrease, and many times lamas will point this out. They'll say, like, if you're doing like practices, like trying to cultivate bodhicitta, or trying to cultivate understanding emptiness, or trying to cultivate patience, or some other practice, and you find that, like, it's really hard to, it's like, at a certain point a person could feel like, wow, I'm doing this, but I don't feel like I'm making progress. They say, then go away and do purification practice for a while, right? Like, stop, focus on that. He said, then when you come back, suddenly you'll find, oh wow, I can move forward now. Like, the obstacles are removed, and when I meditate on that, my mind actually starts to, like you're describing, I can decrease my anger, I can increase my compassion, and so on. And so, so the main sign of success in purification is that you can make progress on the path, actually. And that's exactly what you're saying. So, and that's why, for example, like, I'll just say one more comment here, like, about just like what you're saying. Like, actually, I'll just share this. I mean, this is quite, this is taught in general in the Buddhist teachings, but I was really struck by this. Like, even Khensa Rinpoche himself, right, who's what, like, I think he's about 80 years old, and he's been abbot of Yume Tantric College, he's a senior teacher at Saramay University, Monastic University. He's one of the great teachers, And one day he was saying that he was thinking of doing some retreat, like for himself, his own practice, like he was going to go do it. And then he said, oh, first I'll do a whole bunch of purification practices, 100,000 Vajra Sattva mantras, 100,000 prostrations. And it was like, and he was saying, because the main way to, it was something, he didn't say this, but it's like, the point he was getting at was that the main way to make progress is to remove negative karma, right? Like, then whatever you're trying to cultivate, you can more easily have success. And that's what Lama Tsongkhapa said also in another place. That, so the main sign of success in purification practice is, of course, becoming a gentler, kinder person who is less inclined to do negative actions and have strong afflictive emotions. Yeah. That's the most important sign of progress, for sure. Any other questions about this 4 powers of purification? And I'll just say another comment, like the 4 powers of purification, they're greatly emphasized in all Tibetan Buddhist traditions. And it's a practice on the one hand that many people will do each night, go through the 4 powers and sort of look back at their day and say, how did I do today? If something I did negative, I want to purify it now. You know. So that's one way to do it. And then also people will do retreats, you know, like whether it be a weekend or a day-long retreat or 3 months or however long you want, you know, where they sort of can go back, you can go back over your life, you know, and you can sort of reflect on all the negative things you've done and try to purify and, you know, and have purity. So there are many different, you know, you can apply this as a daily practice, you can apply it in retreats where you sort of more deeply give yourself time to sort of look at what are my negative patterns and how do I want to change them. You know, so, and you can do it as much as you want, but it's a very powerful practice to change. So.
What's the relationship between negative karma that we did in this life versus past lives in terms of their effect or their power, given that if Lama Tsongkhapa says don't engage in negative actions is the best, well, we've already had an infinite number of previous lifetimes when we engaged in a great deal of negative karma. So we can't never have done it.
Right.
We've already done it. So what's the relationship between those two types of?
Yeah, it's a good question. Like, I mean, the relationship between those two types of negative. I guess that, you know, one thing that I think is implied in what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying is that, you know, in terms of negative karma we created in past lives, I mean, we can't refrain from that because it's already done. So all we can do is purify it, right? So I mean, the main difference really is that, at least if it's in, I guess another one is that we can remember the ones in this life, you know, which we can't remember consciously. Most of us can't remember. I can't remember my past lives. So, but both have to be purified. Actually, is part of the point here, and that's why, you know, even Lama Tsongkhapa himself, if you look at like his life story, like, you know, if you read Lama Tsongkhapa's life story, like he was, you know, he became a monk as a very young child. He was like, you actually can't. I mean, there's nothing in his life. He was unlike Milarepa. He didn't kill anybody. He was the kind of person where from childhood on he was doing retreats and studying Dharma and you know, helping others and sort of. He was a very pure person. But even he, right, when he went to retreat at Wolka Chodong, you know, like he did that like long retreat. He did like, what was it? You know, reciting the names of the 35 Buddhas along with prostrations, right? It was said he did what, 3.5 million of those, and he did many Vajrasattva, you know, so, I mean, his own life reflects what was he purifying. It had to be from past lives, right? So again, he was setting an example, I think, for us about, you know, that we need to purify our karma from past lives. And one other point I'll make is that one way, you know, we can't remember our past lives, most of us, you know, but one is, of course, we can say, well, we've created every negative karma possible, you know, at some point, because beginningless lifetimes, so we can purify all of that. But then another is by looking at, I've personally found this useful, it's in the teachings, but I can say from my own experience I found this useful, is if you study these teachings we just studied about karma, actually, which are wonderful, right? One way of meditating on them is you can, you know, because it describes the effects, right, of past negative actions in past lives on this life, right? And so one thing you can do is it's not hard to sort of see, oh wow, I must have had a really strong inclination to this negative karma, because look at me in this life. Like I have a tendency to do it again, my environment reflects that, my experiences reflect that. I must have done quite a lot of that in a past life. Now that doesn't mean I didn't do other ones that aren't manifesting yet or something, but that's one way to sort of use the teachings on karma to help us reflect on our past lives and then purify that karma, which I found it useful. Does that make sense, kind of? But does that fully? I don't know if there's more. Do you have other thoughts on that?
So I have a general question for beginner.
Yeah.
So I guess I've had this question for a while. All the different practices and meditations. Is there an approach to that? Because I'm learning a lot of things, like, you know, purification practice and different mantras and meditations that you're taught to do. So is there a guide to that, like day to day, how you incorporate it so that you're able to do things effectively?
Yeah, it's a very good
It's like
question.
a practical question.
It's a very good question. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of, I mean, the general, like, one thing I'll say is, I think your question's a very natural question, because if you look at, particularly the Tibetan Buddhist traditions, so you say this, like, like, in other words, if you were to try to do every practice, you know, that exists, it's impossible, right? Like, because there's so many. Like, it's kind of like Tibetan Buddhist spiritual tradition is kind of like Tibetan Buddhist art, you know, it's like, there's so much color and so many options and so many things, right? And even if you look at, like, the different, you know, like, in other words, you know, whether you did, like, the mantras, right? Like, so you can say, oh, you can do the practice of Shakyamuni Buddha, and of Tara, the female Buddha of compassion, and Avalokiteshvara with Om Mani Padme Hum, and then it goes on, and then you say, well, you can't do those all in one day. It's impossible, right? If you keep going, and eventually you say, well, there's only this many hours I have to sleep and eat, and it's impossible. But, so I guess I want to first acknowledge, I think your question is very reasonable. And I'll go through, like, the three most important, I think, practices, like that, and not just me saying it, but also, like, I mean, I believe it's true, and also, like, Lama Zopa Rinpoche and Khensa Rinpoche and the Dalai Lama, they all kind of have said the similar thing. So, so I think I would stick with that to start with, because it's, like, very reasonable, I think. So it would be this. It would be the three most important things to do, I think. The first one is in the morning, like, you know, it doesn't have to be long, but whether you take 10 minutes or whether you take longer, you know, an hour, it doesn't matter, but as it's your own schedule, but anybody can take 5 minutes to do this, is in the morning, is to, like, before we sort of start engaging in daily activities, our normal, is to, they usually say is to pause and meditate a little bit in the morning, right? And the key, you know, like, you may start with a little bit of breathing meditation or something like that to calm your mind, like we do in the session, but again, it could be, Khensa Rinpoche says even like 5 breaths or 21 breaths or something like that. And then to cultivate a positive motivation for the day. And that's the most important one. So in the morning, the most important practice really is to cultivate, to remember, like, what's the purpose of my life, you know? And, like, you know, that there are a lot of influences on us to sort of get distracted from that. You know, no insult to that, but I mean, just like, you know, whether it be the media or TV or friends or whatever, work, or, you know, all these different things, they don't always remind us, practice bodhicitta, practice compassion, the purpose of life is love and compassion and kindness. So the most important thing in the morning is to really stop and to say, you know, this life is precious, what's the purpose? You know, so you might do a little breathing meditation, but then the most important one is to ask yourself, okay, this life is precious, this day is precious, I don't know how many more days I have, the truth, you know, that's just our basic truth of our existence is, I don't know that. So how do I want to spend this day, you know? And so the minimum would be that in the morning. And you might, and if you've taken refuge, you know, take refuge and then think that. Right? So you might take refuge and just think, what's the purpose of my life today? What do I want to have in my heart as my essence for today? So that's one of the three things. A second of the three things would be that, again, the Lamas usually suggest, is at the end of the day to look back, and that's where you would do the 4 powers of purification. So you would look back on your day and say, how did I do today? You know, and if you did, and actually if you did well, like if you mostly lived with love and compassion and kindness and respect for others, they say then just rejoice. Actually, just feel how wonderful. You know, I'm so glad I lived a good day today. And if you made some significant errors, you know, if you said something or did something or thought something, you know, if you made some mistake, then they say then that is really good at night. And you don't have to do, again, it doesn't have to be, you can do a 5-minute version, you can do an hour longer, it doesn't matter, but do some version of the 4 powers of purification. And you just say, you know, so if you really were mean to somebody, or you really, you know, got caught up in some negative, you know, if you really got caught up in anger or something, you know, to reflect back and to say, okay, I got caught, you know, I'm human, but I want to, you know, or how does that cause me suffering? Why do I want to change, right? And again, you know, once you're used to these, you know, it could take, again, you could spend hours on it, or you could do it in 5 minutes, but to really look back and go, oh wow, I did that again. You know, like sometimes you already know your pattern, and you say, oh, I did that one again today. You know, in general I'm getting better, but today I got caught. Okay, why did I get caught? how, you know, I don't want to get caught like that. You know, that's a version of this, right? And you do maybe, whatever, do the 4 powers in that context. So that's the second one. And then the third one, in terms of Lam Rim, I want to say, because that's the core practice, actually, right? You know, and the Dalai Lama always says this, you know, reciting mantras or reciting long prayers or that is not as important as meditating on Lam Rim. You know, he says that, and Khenchen Rinpoche says the same thing. The essence is using reason, you know, and using our mind to actually contemplate. But what they suggest is this, again, is like, so if there were 3 main things, it's set your motivation and purify. And the third one, if you can, is to meditate even for a few minutes a day and on the Lam Rim, and just to pick what I, like Lama Tsongkhapa Rinpoche and Khenchen Rinpoche say the same thing, which is, you know, even like, let's say for a month, to just pick one topic from a month, you know, and say for that month, and again, it doesn't have to be like some retreat or something, it's just, you know, like 10 minutes a day, a half hour, whatever you want, you know, like whether you do 10 minutes a day, whether you do a half hour a day, to actually pick a topic. Like, so if it were karma, right, so you might say, okay, so for August I'm going to contemplate the teachings on karma, and each day just spend a few minutes really kind of thinking about them and analyzing them in the reference to my own life and experience, not reviewing just what it says in the book, but, you know, I'm going to apply that to my life. And then the next, you know, and then, or you might start, you know, usually start at the beginning, right? So maybe 1 month I'll do spiritual teacher, next month I'll do precious human rebirth, next month I'll do impermanence and death, and so on. And in that way, over the course of a year, actually you cover, you know, over a year or two, you go through the whole Lam Rim, and you start to really, it starts to, what's the word, like, it's not just some, Pabonka Rinpoche uses this analogy of like, you know, if you have vegetables that are just sitting there, they don't do anything, but if you put them in the soup and you boil the soup, then it becomes a soup. So it's like these teachings are like in your refrigerator once you study them, but it's like then you have to put them in the soup and cook it. That's the cooking process, like, so to speak. And so, and what Khenchen Rinpoche actually has said sometimes, and Lama Tsongkhapa says the same thing, is, you know, you may think, oh, well, I'll never realize the higher teachings in the Lam Rim, you know, emptiness and bodhicitta. But what they say is, let's say you do that, even if you do 20 minutes a day, 10 minutes a day of meditation on Lam Rim, and you go through a month, and you do that over a year, you know, then after 10 years, right, it's like, wow, that's a lot of time meditating on the practices. And they point out, like, you know, if you're doing the purification, you're doing the motivation, then you'll see a real difference, or your practice will transform. And what they say is, whereas if you just recite a bunch of mantras, for example, I mean, that's fine, there's nothing wrong with that, but that doesn't lead to the same kind of transformation. Does that make sense? And actually, and Khenchen Rinpoche points this out. He says, actually, like, so for example, like reciting mantras or doing deity practices or things like that, he says, like, until you've realized the Lam Rim and Rinpoche used to say the same thing. Once you've gained real progress in the Lam Rim from the very first point, reliance on the spiritual teacher, up through realizing bodhicitta. He says, they say, once you've made a lot of progress on those, then if you do those mantras and deity practices, because they're motivated by all that other experience, they'll be very transformative. And they'll actually have their effect. Whereas they say, if you meditate on those too much before you've done these other things, they sort of, you know, it's sort of like, it becomes more like, I don't know, like reviewing a movie you saw in your head or something. Like, it's okay, but it's not really transformative in that sense. So that's the advice, would be those 3 things. Good motivation in the morning, 4 hours at night, and however much time you have to meditate on Lam Rim. And, you know, the other thing with the Lam Rim is you could do, you know, if you're busy, do 5 minutes, and if you have time, like let's say you have a leisurely day one day, or you're not, you know, you're off work or something like that, you know, then do 45 minutes or something. You know, like, it doesn't have to be the same every day. You could put more time or less time. But the advice that oftentimes the Lamas give is, you know, even if some days you only do 5 minutes and other days you do a half hour, if you're doing it every day, and you stay with a certain topic for a month, let's say, and you could vary, you know, if you want to stay with a topic for 2 months, fine, but the idea is like not to just, not to do 2 days on a topic and 2 days on the next, because it doesn't, then it's like, it'd be like if you put carrots in your soup and took them out after 2 seconds and then put celery in and took it out, like nothing's gonna, you know, and then you say, well, it's not, and then you say, wow, it doesn't taste like anything yet. Because you have to let it cook for a while, so to speak, you know. Does that answer the question? Okay. I think that's a very practical way to do it. And that's not, I mean, I'm suggesting it, but it's based on what Lama Tsongkhapa Rinpoche, Khenchen Rinpoche, even the Dalai Lama have all said. So I think it's very practical. Yeah, and I'll say too, like, even, and Reverb used to say this, he used to say, if you do that, he used to say that, you know, you may think it's difficult, and he would say, but actually over time, he said, you will realize the topic. He said, actually, it'll happen. You'll realize certain topics of the long run. And some will take longer and some will take shorter, but he said it'll happen because that's the nature of the mind, actually. So in other words, what you become familiar with and what you put effort into, especially if you're purifying the negativities and you're accumulating positive karma, and then you're making some effort at that, it'll just happen. You know, over time, it'll progress. I mean, not perfect, but it'll progress. And they all said that, so I'm just saying that's what the tradition would suggest. Yeah, it's the same. I'm just pausing to think. I mean, you know, I was giving that, but even all this. Actually, I'm just thinking. Like, even I was just reading something at a teaching. It was about which is different. You know, it was about Dzogchen. I was looking at this book, and I was saying that. And it was saying the same thing. Actually, it was saying, you know, if you want to realize Dzogchen, which is not a Gelugpa emphasis, but it was saying the same thing. You have to meditate on these topics. It was a different, slightly different order, but it was saying the exact same thing. You have to meditate on these topics. Otherwise, your mind won't be able to do those other things. So, you know, whether it's the mantra, deity practices, or Mahamudra, or Dzogchen, there are so many different practices, but they all rely on these insights. And if you don't change these things, then those don't work, actually. You know, is to say, I'm going to meditate on the ultimate nature of mind, which is like some kind of very subtle thing. If you haven't, you know, if we're still caught up in hurting other people, it's not going to work, right? Like, it can't work. So we have to focus on these teachings first. So they're the foundation of everything. Other questions? Go on to the last.
I was just going to make a comment. The part where he says, so you can do all this purification, but it's best if you just don't do it, just sort of made me chuckle because I have had, like when I was younger, my Catholic friends were like, it's really cool to be Catholic, you can do whatever you want, and then you just go confess it on the weekend.
That's funny.
And had another friend who was like, you know, this whole thing with Jesus and the forgiveness, I can spend my life not doing all these things because they're not appropriate, and someone else can spend their life doing whatever they want, and in the end we get the same reward if they just take Jesus, you know, even on their deathbed. So they got to do whatever they want their whole life, and so it's interesting. I feel like he's kind of cutting that off by saying you can purify, but that doesn't mean you should do whatever you want and then purify.
No, right, because everything. Well, and what he's getting at also, I mean, yeah, you're right, and because everything, you know, because of dependent origination, you can't, like, it doesn't matter what your title is, what your religion is, like, you can't escape interdependence, and like, and we know that actually, right? Like, there is, I mean, I think it's like, you know, what he's saying, I mean, I'm just going to take, I mean, he's talking about karma, right? But, you know, if you say something really mean to a family member, and then you very sincerely apologize, they can forgive you, right? But you still said it, you know, and they still remember that you said it. And sometime they may feel bad when they think about that, and feel hurt still. And the apology is better than not apologize. It's the same point, right? It's better to apologize sincerely and have them forgive you, but it doesn't erase what happened. And I think it's very realistic, isn't it? You know, and then he's saying the same thing about karma, right? Like, we can purify it, but it's still, you know, we still did the action, and that's still there in the same way. And it is better not to have, you know, or not to have done it. It's obviously true, right? So I think it's quite realistic in a sense. Yeah, any other? Okay.
I think you said that Vajrasattva was the tantric form of the Buddha?
It's one of the tantric forms, yeah.
Okay, and on page 100, the poem that you read, what does that have to do with it?
Oh, okay, so that's a quote from a particular tantra that's mentioned there, the tantra requested by Subahu. And so what that's saying is, it's a you know, that what that poem is getting at, where it talks about recitation in the poem numerous times. So that poem is sort of giving different similes or I guess you could say, or metaphors, or you know, for the power of reciting, or the effects of reciting Vajrasattva's mantra. Because right above that it says, like the 100-syllable one. So that's a reference. The 100 syllable is a famous mantra of Vajrasattva. And so what this is saying is, if you in conjunction with the 4 powers, if you recite that mantra, then it will be like the power of that practice will be like the flames of a fire that burn off. You know, just like the flames of a fire burn off the underbrush, this practice will burn off your negative karma. Or just like the warm sun rays in the spring melt the sort of winter snow, that practice will melt away your negative karma. Or just like a butter lamp lights the darkness, you know, or like if you turn on the lights, it turns, you know, it eliminates the darkness. The power of that practice of Vajrasattva will be like that for your negativity, is that it will be eliminated like the darkness is eliminated. So it's sort of saying that those are the benefits of doing that practice for us, if we do it well. Yeah, so the poem's referring back to that 100-syllable mantra, which refers to Vajrasattva. So it's saying, yeah, it's saying that if you do that practice, this is the kind of thing that will happen. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
So what's the difference between like purifying negative karma and accumulating merit?
Oh, so those are 2 different things. Like the purifying negative karma is through these 4 powers, right? So you're thinking, what did I do? Like there has to be a basis of a negative thing you've done, right? And then you're doing these 4 powers in order to either stop it from ripening, or purify it, or decrease its power, or something. And you know, as he said, one of those kind of things. Whereas accumulating merit is a different thing, right? Accumulating merit is where you are creating new positive karma, right? In order to have good experience. Like, let's say, whether it be a good future rebirth, or whether it be to progress on the path to Buddhahood, or something like that, right? So you think of the 4 powers of purification, right? It's like this, right? So if you think, oh, today I stole something, right? And then I analyze, wow, that was really hurtful. It's creating bad karma for me. It hurt this other person. You know, and I purify, right? I do this practice. That's purification, right? Whereas new positive karma would be like, so for example, if I say, I want to create positive merit to have good experiences in the future and realize the past, so I'm going to make offerings to the Buddha with that motivation, or I'm going to help somebody else with that motivation. And you're creating a positive karma, right, that will lead. And remember that point in the teachings here, I don't know if you were here, that it was saying, for example, there's like a special kind of human rebirth with 8 qualities. Yeah. And so it's like talks about, you know, so for example, like having a strong constitution, and that comes from helping others with difficult tasks, right? So that's not purifying anything, that's just saying, I want to have that kind of quality in the future, so I'm going to do this kind of action.
I mean, so how does the mind deal with that?
With which?
The mind, like accumulating merit and then purifying negativity. Is it one mind that is doing that?
I mean, it's the same person has to do both, but at different times. So you're not doing it at the same moment, though.
Yeah.
So like, you know, and if you look at like the 7 limbs, you know, at the beginning of the practice, they say 6 of the limbs are to accumulate merit, right? You know, remember like at the beginning of the Lama, but the confession one is to purify negative karma. So you don't do them at the same moment. Like, you know, as you're doing the other 6, and then you do the purification, you know, whichever order, but you do when you do your confession purification practice, that time is to purify negative karma, whereas the other is to accumulate merit. And also like when people do retreats, like so for example, there's a practice like, oh, you did some of that, Nundros, right? Mm-hmm. So like when you're doing the Vajrasattva or the prostration practices, for example, where you're reciting, if you're doing the 35 names of the Buddhas, then you're focusing on purification mostly, right? So that's the mind's focus at that time. But when somebody's making, say, mandala offerings, they're trying to accumulate merit at that time, right? Positive karma. And they're not focusing on purifying at that time, right? They're not thinking, oh, I did this bad thing, and I want to fix that, and here's why. At that time, they're thinking like, you know, I want to be able to offer everything to all sentient beings, right? I want to have the merit to be able to help others who are in poverty and so on. And they're doing mandala offerings as a way to create karma, to be able to help others. So it's a different mindset at that time. Does that make sense? Yeah. So it could be the same person, but it would have to be a different time. Because yeah, you can't do both at the same instant, right? Because the one you're going through this practice, whereas the other you're focusing on some other, on devotion or on compassion, or, you know, and then sort of trying to create new positive karma. Does that answer that?
Yeah.
Okay. Other comments or questions? So maybe I'll just pick up where we left off, because we still have, what, 15 minutes, okay. So actually, this is the end of a section, right? Remember, there are 3 scopes in the Lam Rim, right? The whole Lam Rim is broken down into 3 scopes. So we're right now still in the section on the low scope, right? Or the better way to say that, though, because Lama Tsongkhapa pointed this out, is practices in common with low scope, right? Because Mahayana, there's bodhisattvas and Mahayana practitioners also have to practice, right? So it's not just for somebody with a low scope, but it's saying even bodhisattvas have to practice these practices also. But then they're doing it with the Mahayana, with bodhicitta. Right? But so here we're ending the low scope section of this text, actually. And so Lama Tsongkhapa says, he's finishing up the section, right? And so he's saying, what's the measure of having an attitude of a lesser being, or low scope? Here the translator says lesser being, but low scope. How do you know if you've succeeded in the low scope practices? And when have you realized that? Going back to Cynthia's question earlier, like, how do you know if you've been doing these practices over and over again? How would you know when you've really made progress, right, with these practices? And he answers that question here. He says, previously you had an uncontrived interest in this world only. So what he's saying is, before you started practicing Dharma, right, your uncontrived, your natural inclination was, I want to be happy right now. And when he says this world, he means in this life, preferably today. My happiness today is the most important thing. And maybe some people would include, so for example, actually it's true, like my happiness and my people's happiness. Sometimes it's just my own happiness, right? Other times you might include like, well, for me to be happy, my kid has to be happy too, because if they're crying, it gives me a headache. So I want them to be happy also, or my parent or my best friend, and even like we might want to hurt their enemy then, right? I want to harm my friend's enemy. So that's all what he's contriving. It's uncontrived in the sense that you don't have to make an effort to give rise to that, right? You naturally only care about your own happiness, and there's nothing and the point is that there's nothing spiritual about that, right? You could say that's, if you're at that level, when we're at that level, I'm not saying somebody else, when we're at that level, we're spiritually, on a spiritual level, we're no different from, like an ant. Like an ant also runs away from when you bound on the table and runs towards sugar. Right? We're just like that. We're running towards what seems pleasurable to us, and we're running away from what seems unpleasurable to us. And even ants bring back sugar to their nest because that helps them survive, right? So that's what he says, uncontrived interest in this life. That's that, right? There's nothing spiritual about that. It's just survival and my own pleasure, and the pleasure of my group. Even we might think, well, I want my country to be okay, so I'll kill those people in that other country, and so on. He says, and your interest in future worlds, right? So he's saying like future lives or spiritual goals was just a vague understanding, fascinated with the words, right? So he's saying either you had no interest at all in sort of something spiritual, like your future lives, or liberation or enlightenment, or it was sort of like, if you did have an interest, it was sort of like, how do you say it? A vague understanding fascinated with words, right? That's a good description, isn't it? Like, I don't know, like a book you read somewhere, right? You might say, oh yeah, I once read that book years ago. That was cool. I like Charles Dickens. And also, yeah, future lives are important, like interesting story. So in other words, but it wasn't really important to you. Then he says, when future worlds, right? So he's saying when future lifetimes, that's the minimum requirement, have become the main interest, and this world nothing but a byproduct, their ranking have been switched, then the attitude of a lesser being has been developed. As it is nevertheless needs to be made stable, you should strive, that is, train in it, even after it has arisen. Right? So what he's saying is, there comes a point, right, if you contemplate all these teachings on the suffering of the lower realms, right, all these different, death, and, if you start to realize that I could die any second, just that, then naturally, which is true, right? Then naturally, your sense of grasping at the importance of, what's the word, like my status and my status, my wealth, my importance, my reputation, all those kind of things decreases, right? That's what he's getting at. And when there comes a point where you're more interested in spiritual goals, in your future lifetimes and other spiritual goals, than you are in those kinds of things about this life, he's saying, then you've given rise to the attitude, you've succeeded in giving rise to the attitude of a lesser scope being. And so, for example, going back to karma, right? There is, if you haven't yet given rise to that attitude, right, then you don't think that much about karma. And if somebody, what's there to say? Like, actually, think of it this way. Here's a good way to say it, right? Whereas if you haven't given rise to that attitude and you think, oh, by lying to this person, I'll gain more profit, right? Then you might lie. Right? When you've given rise to this attitude, you start to feel, you would actually feel, well, why would, like, that's not worth lying about. Like, in other words, I'm going to lie to get some, like, what's the word? Like, I'm going to lie so that they think better of me when they may die tomorrow and I may die tomorrow. That's not worthwhile. Like, that's a waste of time. You feel like those kind of things are, it's like it seems childish or silly or like foolish in a way to you, right? Not you're blaming somebody else, but you would feel, for me to do that would seem foolish and self-destructive. And like being the kind of person who's honest and who's caring and who's compassionate is more important, right, than most things. And also, developing spiritually is more important than developing materially, right? Getting ahead or having temporary comfort or something like that, right? And so he's saying, when you've given rise to that kind of attitude where your future lives are more important to you than the sort of status and temporary wealth and self-promotion of this life, you've given rise to this attitude, and then he says, then continue to train in it, right? It doesn't mean you stop, but it means like you've succeeded, and now you just have to keep that focus. Well, maybe I'll finish, and then we'll see if there's time for questions. I'll finish this last part. Then he says, he just addresses a couple of people's doubts. One doubt that he says some people could have is they could say, well, in some scriptures, in some Buddhist teachings, it says that one should ideally turn one's mind away from all samsaric stuff, right? All samsaric pleasure. And then he's saying, so for that person who reads that in a scripture, right, whereas it develops renunciation. So renunciation is the mind wishing for enlightenment that has no interest in samsara, in anything in samsara. He's saying somebody might read a quote like that, which is a valid quote, and think, well, wait a second, then why are you so concerned about future lives? Future lives are still samsara, right? So he's addressing that somebody might think that, right? And then he's saying, it's true that we need to strive for enlightenment and liberation from samsara. And then he's saying, but realistically, you're not going to achieve that if you don't have a good basis, a good body and mind in your future lives to continue practicing. So he's saying, so these are not two contradictory things. If you want to continue to progress along the path, you have to be able to understand these points and create the karma to have good future lives so that you can continue to practice. Because if you develop, for example, if you develop hatred and you kill and you do, killing, you're going to end up, not only will you not achieve liberation, you'll wind up in the lower realms, and then you won't be able to practice at all, and that's a totally useless thing to have happen. So he's saying, with respect to that, there are both temporary and ultimate goals to strive for. Right? So that's what he's saying. If you think, for a low scope being, they might just think, if they're really a low scope being, they might just think, all I care about is having a good future life, right? Which is like Buddhists can be like that in other religions, right? Where you say, I just want to go to heaven, right? For myself, like I want to get out, or I'm miserable and Buddhists sometimes say I want to go to a pure land, right? And some other religions they say I want to go to heaven. And what he's saying here is, from a Buddhist point of view, the goal of going to a good place at the time of death is a valid goal, but it's not. It should be recognized as a temporary goal on the way to something better, which is either your own liberation if you're a middle scope being, or full enlightenment of Buddhahood to benefit all sentient beings if you're practicing the Bodhisattva path. So he's saying, but those are not contradictory, right? If you want to practice to achieve your own liberation only from samsara, you still need good future lives. And if you want to become a Buddha, you certainly need good future lives in order to keep practicing. So he's saying recognize that these short-term goals are part of you moving towards long-term goal, your ultimate goal, or your final goal. Then he says, oh, and then he makes the last point he makes is kind of a fine point of distinction, which is, he says here, not all that is high status of an excellent body or excellent possessions and excellent retinue is included in samsara, psychic existence. Here what he's saying is, also, when we create positive karma to have a good body and environment and so on in future lives, sometimes that's just a temporary samsaric result. But then he's actually quoting Asanga in his Ornament for Mahayana Sutras, and what he's basically saying is, when bodhisattvas practice generosity, ethics, patience, and joyful effort, they're also creating the causes for good future body and enlightenment, but not just samsaric one. They're creating the causes also for a Buddha's body and environment, which is an ultimate goal. So some of the practices that are, when we practice things like ethics, sometimes the result is a good samsaric, a good rebirth within samsara. But if you're a bodhisattva doing that, then the result is actually beyond samsara. It's a Buddha's body and mind, Buddha's environment. Like, which is like, so like for example, you could be creating the causes to create a pure land for others, actually to become educated in. That's not within samsara, that's in nirvana. That's a Buddha's environment, a Buddha's expression of their qualities. And he's saying, so also not all good karma is a result, not all good karma has a result that's within samsara. There are ways of creating good karma that are, where the result will be beyond samsara. And he's just making he's just making a fine point of distinction there in a sense, so that we don't get confused on that point. So that ends the section on the low, he called it path of, is he calling it lesser beings? I kind of prefer lesser being, low scope, I like to say low scope. Because it's the scope of one's mind when doing these, so it's the practice in common with a being of lesser scope. So any questions about that last part before we finish up? So I have a question for you guys. So just to remember, so a low scope practitioner, right? Or is it this is in common with a low scope, right? So a person with bodhicitta would still be doing these practices. But if you just say with low scope or lesser being, just for people who have been following along, what's the goal of a lesser being?
Future happiness.
Future happiness tomorrow?
Next life.
Yeah, so the goal of a person, there is and remember what we said early on in the text, I just want to remind people. So what we were saying is this, this text in a sense, right, is talking about the path, right, Lamrim, the stages of the path, right? And so I'm just reminding you guys, because we covered this at the very beginning, but I just want to remind people. Right, so what this is saying is, we just finished the section on low scope, and really what that's saying is, many times we human beings live with no spiritual, we're not doing anything at all that has any spiritual significance. Right? We're just entertaining ourselves or fighting with people or promoting ourselves or trying to get ahead of other people or whatever. That has no spiritual significance at all. Right? That's what that's not yet a spiritual practice. Right? And then what this is saying, this low scope is saying is the lowest rung, in a sense, of if you're going like step by step, where one is sort of at the lowest level where one is actually a spiritual person, right? A Dharma practitioner, somebody who's practicing Dharma, practicing a spiritual path. The lowest level of spirituality is wanting to have a good future life, a good future rebirth, right? And so that would include, like, if somebody says, I want to be reborn in a pure land, or I want to be reborn in a heaven, or I want to be reborn as a divine being somewhere, an angel or something like that. Like, that's a spiritual goal, it's saying, right? And what this text is saying is if you're doing that, because you recognize, well, like, I want to have a better life in my future lives after death, because death can come at any time. That's a valid form of spiritual practice, but from a Buddhist point of view, that's the lowest level that qualifies as Buddhist, as not as Buddhist, but as spiritual. Because it's something beyond just your own wealth or temporary comfort or temporary pleasure or temporary status. It's something that goes beyond this life, but they would say that's, again, that's the point, that's the lowest of all. Like, and if somebody only has that level of motivation, then they would say that's the person who's practicing a spiritual path with the lowest scope, in the sense that their mind is only embracing a little bit of what's possible spiritually. But it is a valid spiritual thing to do. And then it's saying, and then what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying here is, but even somebody who has a very vast scope, right, like wishing to benefit all sentient beings throughout all of time and space and everyone everywhere, they still have to do these practices, right? In other words, to think, because I want to benefit all beings, I don't have to be ethical, I don't have to avoid bad karma. That's foolish, right? So it's saying whether you actually have that lesser scope in your mind of just caring about having a good future rebirth, which is a valid spiritual goal, or whether you're like a bodhisattva who's trying to benefit all sentient beings, you still have to do this practice. And so these are the foundational practices for anybody who's practicing a spiritual path, according to the Buddhist tradition. And so we just finished that section, just to be clear. Does that make sense to people? So, and so now we're going to move on to the intermediate scope, the middling scope, that's a bigger scope than this one, but not yet the greatest of scopes. Does that make sense? So the next section will be, if you're a person who's practicing spirituality who wants to do something more than just achieve a good future life, what would be a bigger scope than that, but it's not yet the biggest of all scopes. So there's the three scopes, right? The smallest, the middling, and the great. And so we finished the small. Now we're moving on to the middle. And one more point I'll make, so that's that. And then I'll make one more point just in general, which is, so the next class we have is back to our normal time, but it's actually 3 hours. We're doing whenever we finish a section, we do like a 3-hour class where we meditate on that. So this time we're not going to meditate on the whole low scope rather, because we already did some of it. What we'll meditate on is karma. Right? So in the next class we have, it'll be from 10:30, 11:30 to 1:30. And it'll be focusing on meditation on the teachings on karma, where we'll sort of do guided meditations on karma. And then after that, the following class after that, we'll pick up starting the middle school. Do you have a question?
So you manage not to lie, kill, steal, all those things, but you're only focused on having a better future rebirth, so you're still at the lowest
level of spiritual practice.
Because it's your intention that's more important than...
Well, the idea we'll get into it next time more, but I'll just explain very briefly. The idea is this, is that what they're saying is that, yeah, that intention is valid in a sense, and is spiritual, but first of all, it's just temporary. You know, what they would say is, so like Buddhist tradition would say, okay, so let's say the person does that, and they do achieve a good future rebirth. Well, next section, what we'll get into is, there are still problems with that. Whereas because even within, as long as you're still in samsara, you're still going to suffer actually. You know, so it's better than a bad future life. But the reality is you still have all these problems, right? Like, and also it's not a permanent solution to the problem. So that's why they would say it's a valid goal, but it's still not broad enough in a way ultimately, because even for yourself actually. You know, so let's say you were born as a king or a queen or whatever, like, well, they have a lot of stress actually, you know, like, so you're wealthy and you have like a strong body or something, but there are still a lot of problems you're going to face. And so they're saying that's, not good enough in a way. And according to Buddhism, they would say even heavenly realms or something, they would say, well, even those aren't permanent. They may last as long as a world system lasts, until the sun burns out or something, but even they're not permanent. And so they would say, like, what's a permanent solution to the problem of your own suffering? That's the middle scope. Then they would say, even if you can figure out, which they teach in the next section, what's the problem of a permanent solution to your own suffering? They would say, that's better, but how about others? In other words, so yes, you find a permanent solution, you say, my middle scope is that. I want to achieve a permanent solution to my suffering, not just a temporary one. They would say, well, but how about caring about others that they haven't found that solution yet? And realizing that it's totally unbearable that others don't have that. So the greatest scope would be wishing to give all sentient beings, yourself and all others, a permanent solution to suffering. and having that kind of motivation in your heart would be the greatest of all scopes. So that it's just so it's a difference of sort of, does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah.
And so that would, yeah, so the plan will be next class we'll do 3 hours for anyone who wants to come. We'll meditate on karma. The one after that we'll start on the middle scope, which addresses that, how you develop that middle scope motivation in mind. And